Hey there everyone. So I've done a lot of lectures talking about various postmodern concepts, and every time I start looking at these thinkers like Foucault or Deleuze or Baudrillard, I always feel Hegel in the back of my mind. And partially this is because Hegel really got me into philosophy. He really got me thinking about ontology, about epistemology, and I started off my channel mostly focused on Hegel. But I kind of grew out of that Hegelian phase, to say that in the least pejorative way possible. But I nevertheless find it pertinent to go back and outline what is Hegel trying to do? What are his main contributions? What are his ways of thinking? And how can we make sense of the world through the mindset of Hegel? So fundamentally, Hegel is doing phenomenology. And what phenomenology is it is an epistemological way of understanding the world. Now, epistemological is, of course, deriving from epistemology, the study of knowledge. So what Hegel is trying to do is, he is a systematic philosopher. He's trying to come up with a complete system that will explain all of reality. In this way, Hegel has a lot of similarities to theology, where theology is also trying to make this systematic understanding of the world through the idea of God, or the idea of religion, or the divine, whatever it may be. And in epistemology, we are trying to say, okay, before I can talk about what something is, I have to understand what it means to know what anything is in the first place. When I say this expo marker is black and white, I'm saying statements of existence about this, about what blackness is and about what whiteness is. But Hegel says, well, if I want to understand what something is, I have to understand how it is that I come to know that before I can really make sense of ontology. And this is a great debate in philosophy, which Hegel is not necessarily putting epistemology above ontology, ontology being the study of being, so the being of the white or the black of this expo marker. Hegel's not necessarily putting one over the other, but it's generally acknowledged that his seminal work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, is a text of epistemology. Now, it tells us ontological claims. It tells us things about how the world is, but starting from the vantage point of how do we come to know things. And in phenomenology, the question is concerned principally with phenomena. So how is it that I experience the world? It is not necessarily in abstractions or concepts. So for example, a concept might be a triangle. So we know certain things about triangles. For example, all of these interior angles will add up to 180 degrees. We also know triangles have 3 sides. These are baked into the definition of what it means to be a triangle, not only linguistically in terms of triangle, but also in terms of, how do we situate these concepts, these mathematical concepts in a system? We figure out different ways we can interact with them. But we never actually see a perfect triangle in existence. In reality, what we see is all sorts of shapes which, maybe it's something like, this almost looks like a bell, But you've got varying shapes that look almost like triangles, but they're not perfect triangles. And that's, of course, because this is an abstraction. This exists in a slightly different way than these exist. And that's a whole conversation about the actual versus the virtual, all sorts of stuff. But the difference between concepts like this triangle and reality as we experience it is that these are phenomena. And phenomena can be shapes, they can be emotions, sensations, or affects, they can be feelings, they can be beliefs. But phenomena are what we experience. So Hegel is concerned with our experience, not merely in the abstractions we make up, but the way we actually experience the world. And one of Hegel's problems that he runs into is, how do we experience these phenomena? Do we experience them as exterior entities? Or do we experience them as objects of thought? Now, what does that mean? Now, let's say that we have I, myself, the thing that is doing the experiencing, that is interpreting the phenomena that come into it. And outside, we have a car. And this car is, it's moving, it has lights, it has sounds. When I experience this car, how do I experience sound or light, for example? Well, for sound, I have to hear it through my ears. And for light, of course, I have to see it through my eyes. Now you might be like, okay, who cares? Let's say that this car makes a sound that is 80 hertz. Let's say that's the sound that this car makes. When my ear interprets that sound, what ends up in my consciousness, what I experience as a phenomena, is not 80 hertz. It is not a wave. It is not, some mathematical expression of waves interfering at some points and giving me some sort of perception. What I experience is none of these, but instead, I hear sound. Now, for Hegel, he's making a very fundamental differentiation between this physical event, this physical state of affairs, and the existence of that state of affairs for me. And for me, it exists as something completely different than what it is in itself. Now, in itself, this sound exists in this mathematical sense, and it exists in this physical sense as waves interacting with each other and producing some sort of physical effect. But that physical effect all of this, which is physical, gets interpreted by me and becomes phenomenal. And these things are different. Because when we go from the physical mode of existence here, of hertz and of waves interacting, I perceive a sound, which I experience as being accompanied by various feelings, emotions, beliefs, predispositions. Things which have nothing to do with being reduced to this physical state of affairs. For me, the world, the physical, because that's what this is, right? This physical is the world as it exists in itself. I experience this world not in itself, not as physical, material things, but rather as phenomena. Now, what's the big deal here? It sounds like we've just explained things in maybe more detail than we had thought before, but what have we actually problematized philosophically? Well, it turns out this epistemological understanding of the world greatly problematizes how I can come to know things about this world objectively. Because I don't experience this world objectively, I see it filtered through my senses, through my touch, my taste, my hearing, my sight, my emotional affectations. That necessarily taints this real world with my predispositions, with whatever it takes to get from here to here. And the profoundly confusing and earth-shattering thing about this phenomenological understanding of the world is Hegel would say, if I have this expo marker in my hand, sure, it exists, as something in itself. But for me, it exists only as a phenomenological experience. It exists only for me as my version of green, my version of hardness, my version of largeness or smallness. So the phenomenological understanding of the world takes the world as it exists in itself and problematizes it by showing how the way we perceive and understand and interact with the world at all times is as an object of knowledge. Rather than the notion that this expo marker exists for me as a thing in itself that I just idly perceive, Hegel recognizes that the subjectivity of my perception, the fact that the way I perceive green may be quite different from how someone else perceives green, and how would we know the difference? That's the real question. Because of that subjectivity that taints my experiences, I necessarily taint my ability to talk about this world in an objective sense. By the way, can we take a second to realize how orange this board was? Whoever used it before me just didn't erase it at all. Well, they tried to, but you can see what happened. Now, Hegel is an idealist. And what this means is a realist will say, I experience the world as a thing in itself. Or at least I can know things about the world as it exists independent of my consciousness, of my experiences. And there are ways in which I can understand that real world as a real world without it being tainted by my understanding of that world. But idealism is a little different. And idealism is a problematic epistemology. I am not an idealist myself, but the way Hegel presents idealism is rather convincing, especially when you read Hegel, because he's so good at fleshing out this system, even if he makes some questionable presuppositions in certain steps. What Hegel says is that because I only experience the world as a phenomenological perception, which is to say, as an object of my knowledge of it, I necessarily experience the world as ideal, not as a real thing in itself, but as an ideal, namely as a phenomena, as a perception, as something tainted, and which has gone from in itself to for myself. It has gone from a world we can naively talk about to a world tainted by my perceptions in an irremediable way. And Hegel can really be seen as building on some of the doubt of Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes was trying to do this very thing, where he was trying to find a foundation upon which he could build a sure view of the world, in which he could find a spot that was impossible to doubt. And Descartes came up with this famous thought experiment, and it's since been called all sorts of things, among many of which is the dream analogy. And it's very simple. How do I know I'm not dreaming right now? Today, this is featured in the Matrix films, for example, which I've done a few lectures on, the Matrix on this channel, if you're interested. How do I know I'm not dreaming? And Descartes says, well, I can't use my experiences to tell me that, to make me sure of the fact that I'm not, because I experience things in a dream. And he says, okay, well, I can't use the vividness of these experiences either, because people lucid dream all the time. I've lucid dreamed before. And I can't appeal to some intuition and just say, no, I just feel awake right now. Because that happens all the time in dreams. So Descartes says, okay, this calls the world into question. Because I can be perceiving, and I can perceive while asleep in a dream, and that doesn't mean that the world in my dream exists outside of my thoughts. No, it's totally a figment of my imagination. So Descartes is trying to figure out, well, what's not a figment of my imagination? Is there anything in this world that I can't doubt? And Descartes says, well, there's one thing I cannot doubt, and it is that I am thinking. Because every time Descartes was looking at experiences in the world, what he would do is doubt that thing. And what's wrong with doubting something? Let's call it into question. Let's see how far we can go. The only thing Descartes couldn't doubt was that he was thinking. Because doubting is a form of thinking. So Descartes realized, I presuppose that I am a thinking thing, that I am something which thinks, before I even doubt. And as such, that is my firm foundation. That is what I can know for sure about this world. And crucially for Hegel, how did I figure that out? I figured it out through going into my thoughts alone, in figuring out how do I experience the world, what can I know about the world, about anything outside of my senses. Well, Descartes says, I know I'm thinking. Now, the ontological status of this thinking thing, which for Descartes is the cogito, this is Latin for thinking thing, we know it thinks, but we don't really know much metaphysically or ontologically about what this is. For example, there's the modern thought experiment of the brain in the vat, or the Boltzmann brain. What's to say I'm not just a brain plugged up to a bunch of electrodes, sitting in a vat of liquid, thinking I'm experiencing a real world when I'm not. And for Descartes, he could say he's a thinking thing, but that wouldn't tell him anything about the substance of what is this cogito? Is it a Boltzmann brain? Is it someone who's just asleep? Is it someone in the Matrix? Descartes starts here and he builds off of this. He adds in the surety of God would not let his senses err too much, so the real world probably exists pretty close to what it looks like, but the mistakes are mine. All this stuff. I don't find that part very convincing. But this is a crucial step in idealism. Is at the very least, we know about this thinking thing. We know for sure that exists. So Hegel wants to start there and say, okay, I know that I, as an experiencing thing, am not able to be called into question. I must exist in some fashion because I am perceiving, I am experiencing, I am thinking, and that necessitates that something is doing that. It can't just be nothing thinking, because how would nothing think? It's nothing. There's nothing for it to do. So Hegel says, okay, I have this big circle of subjectivity. And this circle of subjectivity is the I. It is the thing that is thinking, that is experiencing, that is perceiving. And when I'm thinking, I have all sorts of different things populating my mind. I have, perceptions. I have emotions. I have beliefs. I have presumptions. And all of these are the result of what we talked about at the beginning, of the world being filtered. And Hegel has reached the same problematic spot that Descartes has reached. Namely, what do I know about everything outside of here? It's kind of up in the air, right? At least if we're going to take this Cartesian thought experiment seriously. Well, how can I be absolutely sure if, for example, everything in this question mark isn't a dream, if I can doubt it, if I can call it into question? Well, Descartes is going to say, let's bracket that. It is not of concern. Hegel is going to say, well, let's just put brackets around all of that. And like a math equation, we can set that off to the side. We can isolate our variables. and we can figure out the information that's the most important. Namely, the stuff we can be sure about. Because if we can't be ultimately sure about those, at least not at the beginning, why not start with our indubitable foundation, as Descartes calls it? Why can't we start with these perceptions, these emotions, these presumptions, beliefs, affects, and move outward from there? So for Hegel, the world is as it is in perception. And I've mentioned several quotes in my other Hegel lectures where I take you directly to some quotes where he says as much in the Phenomenology of Spirit. For Hegel, to talk about the world as these question marks is a rather frivolous endeavor. And it's tenuous, at least compared to this stuff. But by looking at the way my perceptions and emotions and beliefs and presumptions interact with each other, I can figure out, for example, how might I have gotten from whatever these question marks are to my perceptions, to the phenomena. And if I can figure out the relationship of all this stuff together, if I can find the little points and map a line between them, and I can figure out how I got from one place to another, this necessarily had to come from an interaction with something outside of this circle. There is no question about whether or not there is something outside of this circle. Obviously, there are things other than me. The problematic part for Hegel is, how can I say anything definite about them other than they exist as an other? So this is one of the most important parts of Hegel's philosophy, namely that I have the self, or the one, and I have the stuff outside of this circle of perception. I've got the stuff in the question marks, and this is the other. Now, Hegel, based off of what we've talked about, recognizes that the relation between this self and this other, this one and this other, is one of subject and object. This is a classic dualism that Hegel got from Descartes. And the subject-object dualism is key in Hegel's philosophy, because if we only experience the world as it appears to us, if there's no way for us to experience the world unmediated, then we necessarily experience two things. We experience knowledge as it is subjected to me, and that is pressed up against an object which I'm encountering. That's where the perception is coming from. So all of the stuff in here is surrounded by this I, which is the subject of knowledge. It is the thinking thing, the cogito, the self, the one, whatever you want to call it. It is the subject of phenomenological experience, of knowledge. Everything inside here is an object of knowledge. It exists for me, for myself, like we talked about before, as an object of knowledge. So Hegel isn't really concerned about the objective status of this so much as he is the objective status of this. Because one thing that Hegel figures out, and this is one of the idealist parts of his philosophy that is very profoundly different from Descartes is Descartes says, well, I'm experiencing this expo marker, but I can call it into question the existence of this expo marker by doubting. Now Hegel says, what do you mean by existence? If you mean the existence of this thing in itself, independent of my experience, yes, you can call that into question. In fact, that is never a sure question for Hegel. That's why he can bracket this stuff, because that's beyond what we could ever possibly know, because the only way we know is inside of this circle for Hegel. But in terms of responding to Descartes' ability to doubt the existence of this expo marker, Hegel would say you cannot doubt the existence of this expo marker as an object of knowledge. Namely, I cannot doubt that I am experiencing this expo marker. So in other words, I can doubt what is being experienced independent of my experience, but I cannot doubt both that I am experiencing and that I objectively perceive something as a perception. You might have to play that back a few times, because that's a very critical and different distinction that Hegel is making. That while I can doubt these others as they exist outside of me, in fact I always must, it is impossible to doubt not only that I have these perceptions, but that these perceptions are, as they exist, as objects of my own knowledge, as perceptions. Now, the last thing that's important to understand about Hegel is consciousness and self-consciousness. In a way, Hegel is doing a type of psychology, but it's a very specific type of philosophically rigorous psychology. Because since he's looking at how do we perceive things, how do we perceive them as perceptions, Hegel's in fact figuring out how does the mind work. Not the brain, but the mind. The difference, of course, being between the physical state of matter and the mind being filled with phenomenological experiences. So Hegel says, I experience a number of things, but I can only experience those things insofar as they bear some similarity to what I have already experienced, and indeed to myself. This is roughly what's going on in Hegel's master-slave dialectic, which I've done an hour-long lecture on, going specifically into the master-slave dialectic in the Phenomenology of Spirit. That would be really helpful if you're confused about any of this. But Hegel says, okay, if I have some object out here, this is going to be bad. Let's say it's an apple. When I experience this apple, I experience colors, I experience, maybe it dropped on the ground and it made a sound. I experience the feelings of the way the light reflects off of it. So all of this is transmitted to me as a perception. But in order for me to make sense of that perception, I have to already have had some conception of what is redness. Because let's say that this apple, delivering to my senses, presents me with redness. One of the phenomenological qualities of this apple is its redness. In order for me to understand redness, think about explaining color to a blind person. If you've never seen color before, you have no conceptual schema and no phenomenological quarry of minerals that you can draw from, so to speak, by which you could conceptualize color, specifically redness, and specifically the redness of this red thing. Because, in a way, every red is slightly different from every other red. You're never going to have a mathematically identical red because your perception of color is altered by, your eyes see differently at different times in the day. Mine start to go out later in the day. The way light is reflecting off of it changes the way you perceive that color. There's all these minute differences. So this redness, of course, I will perceive this redness. It'll show up in my perception and in my conscious reflection on the world. But only insofar as I already had some way of apprehending that redness. But what does this mean? What does this mean for the way we experience the world? Well, for Hegel, it presents us with an interesting problem. If I am such and such a way, if I have memories, if I have thoughts, etc., etc. If I have memories and thoughts and perceptions and all this that makes me what I am, how can I experience something that's not me? Well, there's going to be some conflict here. And specifically, there is going to be sublation. Now, sublation exists when I have a state of affairs that exists in such and such a manner. For example, my consciousness and the things inside of my consciousness. This is point A in my dialectic. So I've got point A right here, this being me. Now I have point B that comes along. And point B is different than me in some manner. There is a separation here, which fundamentally problematizes my ability to understand something. Just like we talked about with my phenomenological experience versus the world in itself, it's unsure how we would get from point A to B, how we would be able to learn, how we would be able to change, how we would be able to become. But Hegel says, well, I can understand this insofar as it is similar to me. Insofar as I already have some conception, some psychological schema in order to understand that thing. And there might be some tension here, especially if point B is a traumatic experience, for example. It's going to present me with some complications. It's going to change me. It's going to add something to this totality of what I am. But there is a way to understand B, to break this gap. And that is to understand that I can experience whatever this thing is in itself as an object of knowledge, as myself, as something that I am and thus already have a schema in order to understand. So in fact, this line is more of a dotted line. It's a halfway point in our dialectic. And what happens here is I have 2 points that were at one point separate dialectical moments, as they're called in Hegel's philosophy. And I have sublated them, which is to say, I have resolved them by making them make sense of each other, precisely by retaining a similarity and getting past that difference, this line that has gotten between point A and point B. And this, everything inside this circle, for Hegel, is Geist. Geist is German for spirit, roughly. It also has connotations, of like ghost. It also has connotations like geyser, to swell up, some sort of fundamental primordial eruption. It has lots of other connotations, which I talked about in my other Hegel videos. But this is Hegel's way of understanding the universe, is as Geist. And what happens is the universe gets understood. Everything that is, this point A was the self, was all of this when it knew something at a certain point in time. But what has happened is the self has been forced to come outside of itself and has been forced to tarry with something new. Now, what has happened? The self has tarried with that new thing by sublating itself as something sane, as something which comes back and reaffirms that identity. And these arrows are important because Hegel's system, and he's not shy of this, is essentially, meaning in its very essence, a tautology. A tautology would be A equals A. It is fundamentally circular. The subject, the self, the one, comes out of itself in order to come back into itself, and the self becomes wider as a result. This all becomes Geist, spirit. So the world exists for Hegel as Geist. This is why Die Phenomenologie des Geistes, the phenomenology of spirit. The world for Hegel is a question of figuring out the phenomenological perception of Geist. And Geist is everything. So for Hegel, history, everything that changes and becomes something new, whether it's this dropping, whether it's a historical event, is fundamentally a question of this dialectical sublation. And Geist is on its way to absolute Geist. And specifically, this happens through this sublation, which is when Geist becomes self-consciousness. When it goes out of itself in order to see itself projected in something outside of itself, such that it can be sure of its independent existence in the world, such that it can create some movement, and inside this, history happens inside this bubble. And for Hegel, this movement, this sort of current that goes on, is driven by reason with a capital R. And that's a whole nother video I'd like to do on Hegel's philosophy of history. But hopefully this has made Hegel make a little bit more sense. What are some of his big moves he's trying to do? What are some of his innovations? What are some of his problems? Deleuze has a great refutation of this understanding difference as sameness. But it's very interesting. So please check out any of my other lectures that I've done on Hegel, Heidegger, postmodernism, critical theory, other literature. Join the channel and become a member for $5 a month. And once a month I do a philosophy Zoom that you can tailor to your learning needs. Check out any of my other lectures, and I'll see you in another lecture.